our transition to a net zero water secure future. This session is titled Parched Power. It's about assessing physical climate risks for power generation project portfolios, and it's being led by Tiani Luau from WRI. Over to you, Tiani.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Hello, and welcome everyone to our session. My name is Tiani Luo, and I direct the Aqueduct project at the World Resources Institute. This year has been a year of extreme weather events. We have had exceptional wildfires and droughts in the US, deadly heat waves in Canada, and floods are basically around the world. Climate change is already intensifying extreme weather events and will continue to pose physical risks and threats to people and businesses around the world. So in the next 25 minutes or so, my colleagues, Caitlin Dominic from the OECD and James Folzen from the EBRD are going to join me and share some of our thinking and work done on physical climate and water risk assessments, particularly for the power sector. Kathleen is the program lead for financing water at the OECD. She also manages the Roundtable on Financing Water, a dedicated platform for substantive discussion on financing for water security, a joint initiative of the OECD, the government of the Netherlands, the World Bank, and the World Water Council. And James is the principal with the Green Economy and Climate Action team at the EBRD. He is responsible for structuring green power and energy projects, as well as technical assistance and policy dialogues with national authorities in the EBRD region. Now, over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Tiani, and excellent to be here today on this key topic. We have just started work at the OECD, starting to look at some of the linkages between water-related risks and financial materiality. So I'm going to highlight some kind of general overarching messages that is emerging from that work to help set the scene for this discussion, which will give a deeper dive into the water and energy perspective. So our recent work looking at these linkages between water risks and financial materiality, we've identified what we call a materiality gap between the substantial economic and social impact of water risks, which are already happening today. They're well documented and they're rising, and their financial materiality in the global financial system. And we think there are several reasons why we have this gap between those physical impacts with real economic and social impacts and where we see them showing up in the financial system. So the factors that we think can provide a hint about why we're not seeing more impacts on the financial system. The first is that the evidence and analysis of financial materiality of these risks for the financial system remains very, very patchy and limited to date. So current approaches to risk modeling and risk assessment do not fully capture all types of risks, including water-related risks. And when these are covered, they're not fully priced in. And in fact, this can essentially mask certain risks and their potential impact on the financial sector, leaving regulators and financial institutions unprepared. And here, I think something very clear that comes out of this is that new methodologies and analysis are really needed to have a better understanding here. And I think we're definitely going to hear more about that in this session. Second point that explains this materiality gap is that current prudential regulations for the financial sector do not contain explicit mention of environmental risks. Central banks and governments are just starting to consider the relevance of climate and environmental risks and frameworks in their own supervisory frameworks. For example, we heard at the recent meeting of the Roundtable on Financing Water from the European Central Bank and how they're thinking about their climate stress test for the EU banking system and trying to better understand those emerging physical climate risks. Many of them are related to water and how they can impact on the risk profile of the banking sector. And then a third reason for this materiality gap is that where material financial risks may arise, the financial sector can make use of many risk hedging or transfer tools, which can then reduce the perception of financial materiality of those risks in the system. We think that this is an important and topical issue for both policymakers and financial institutions that really warrants further investigation. And for financial regulators, the issue is that material financial risks may be masked by the current practices of the financial system, which would in fact mean that if and when risks do materialize, the financial sector may not be equipped to deal with them. And so here an important takeaway is, of course, the ignorance of risk does not equal the absence of risk. And then finally, just to wrap up, if and when water-related risks are considered financially material in the financial system, this could in turn impact on the allocation of financial flows, encouraging possibly more money going into investments that can reduce the physical or economic exposure and vulnerability to water-related risks. So that could be a very important development for shoring up investments in water security. So let me stop there and turn the floor over to James Balzan, who from EBRD, who is going to highlight their work on understanding how EBRD's investments in energy might be exposed to these types of risks and what that means from a financer's point of view. So over to you, James.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathleen. And I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that's coming up clearly. So good morning, everybody. I'm from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I'm a principal in the Green Economy and Climate Action team. And I think Kathleen's presentation really sets the scene for what I'm going to talk about in terms of how we as a financial institution are trying to, let's say, reduce our ignorance on some of the risks, to use Kathleen's way of putting it. So just quickly, a few words on EBRD. So EBRD is a multilateral financing institution operating in 30 plus countries from southern Mediterranean across to Central Asia and everywhere in between. And we, in many of our countries, they're extremely water stressed, and with climate change, it's anticipated that many of our regions will have a significant change in water availability, and this is relevant for our financing practices. So in the last few years, I think it's fair to say that the financial sector has really woken up to the potential impacts of the carbon transition and the physical impacts of climate change on their portfolios. Climate-related financial risk is really something that is very much at the top of everyone's agenda in terms of trying to manage risks within a financial institution. A key initiative that's really driven this and provided an important framework for the financial sector to understand climate risk has been the TCFD. Many of you may be aware of the TCFD, so that stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. EBRD, we see lots of uptake on the TCFD, not only in OECD markets but also elsewhere. And EBRD itself is a supporter, and we recently published our second TCFD disclosure a couple of weeks ago. For those that don't know, broadly, the TCFD framework, summarizing very broadly, it essentially requires two dimensions to be explored, managed, and disclosed in financial reporting. The first one is around how does a company fit within the national and global carbon transition. So this is loosely called carbon transition risks. And then the second point is how robust is a company to the physical impacts of climate change, so physical climate risks. And here, water-related risks really is quite a prominent one. So I guess my key point is, at some point this needs to sort of manifest at an operational level. So I work in the banking part of EBRD, and for every investment that we make, where we have to ask a series of questions essentially to as part of our due diligence on an investment. So this process, essentially, it's introducing questions that weren't being systematically asked before. I mean, as a IFI, we have in the past, been incentivized to take a proactive, opportunistic approach. But now it's really about, okay, for every investment that we do, what is the carbon transition risk and what is the physical climate risk? And so this actually introduces a whole series of questions that, we need to have an informed response to. Now, on the carbon transition side, it's around, okay, there's an emissions profile of a company. How does it evolve over time? How would the finances be impacted if a carbon price was introduced? But on the physical climate risk side, which is an area that I'm particularly focused on, we have to kind of understand what are the major physical climate risks facing the company. For example, water stress, flooding, increase in air temperature, and how does that then translate into financial impact? Now, this is not an obvious question. I think in the past, we've definitely had more of a qualitative approach and understood, on specific measures in specific sectors, what kind of benefits they can produce. But I would say there's a lot of work to be done to really be able to, understand, quantify in a way that, if a risk officer asks, what is the potential impact of climate change on this particular investment or, of our energy portfolio, that we can have a really informed response. Now, this is what led to our work with WRI. We decided to focus, we have several different work streams ongoing, but one particular area that we were interested in was our power sector portfolio, in particular our hydropower and thermal power existing portfolio. And essentially what we wanted to understand was what are the physical, how do the physical impacts of climate change translate into generation changes. The next step is to go from generation changes to financial impacts. But what we wanted to set out to do with WRI was to understand that link between climate change and generation impacts. And we partner with WRI that have done this piece of work, and there's going to be a report launched shortly. But I'll hand over to Tiani to share some of the findings. Thanks, Tiani.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Let me just share my screen quickly. All right, thanks. I think we're doing fantastic on time. So, maybe I can talk a little bit more on our results. But again, my name is Tiani Luo. I direct the Aqueduct project at the World Resources Institute. We are a global environmental think tank headquartered in DC. And for the past 2 years or so, we've been working with EBRD on developing a methodology to assess physical climate risks for power plants at the portfolio level. And we tested our method over EBRD's current power portfolio. And so today I just wanted to, and as James said, we're going to launch the report in about in a few weeks. So today I'd like to give you guys all a sneak peek of our research and some of our findings. So before I go into the research and findings, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the scope. Within this project, we really wanted to focus on direct impact on power plants themselves, right? So we're not looking at transmission or distribution systems. We're not looking at fuel transportation, but really just focusing on direct impact on power plant themselves, right? And then with that in mind, we selected these 7 indicators: sea level change, sustained air temperature rise, water temperature rise, water stress, droughts, extreme temperatures, and floods. And we selected these 7 hazards based on 2 things. One is recommendations from mainstream climate disclosure guidelines, such as TCFD. And then the other thing is data availability, climate data availability, right? So very quickly, and a quick overview of EBRD's current portfolio. This is a map showing basically showing you the geographic distribution of thermal and hydropower plants in EBRD's current portfolio. And as you can see, they are very much concentrated in the lower mid-latitude area, which is particularly vulnerable to climate change, as many studies have concluded. So it is very important for us to understand how climate is going to change in the region and how that's going to affect these power plants' future ability or future generation performance. I want to talk quickly on the assessment framework that we developed. Basically, for the power plants that we were looking at, each of the power plant has typically have multiple generating units. So our framework, we actually run each unit through the assessment framework. And one of the questions we need to answer early on is historical generation data available for that unit, right? So if it's available, then we use a machine learning based approach, basically a LSTM regression model. We use that model to estimate generation losses, climate related generation losses with climate data, right? But if historical generation, actual generation data is not available for that unit, then we, which is mostly the case, right? Most cases we do not actually have actual generation data. So in those cases, we run the unit through a vulnerability curve-based assessment model, and vulnerability curves basically translates hazard severity into generation losses. I'll give you an example, right? So 1 degree of increase in air temperature means 0.1% of reduction in generation efficiency for gas turbines, right? So we went through a bunch of literature and collected information, developed specific vulnerability curves for different generation and cooling technology combinations for each of these 5 modules. We have flood module, we have a drought module, water stress module, water temperature module, and air temperature module, which covers the 7 hazard indicators that I introduced earlier. So we run these units through the system with the daily climate data that we have, which are projected into the future. And so we were able to actually evaluate every day, right, how those climate variables affect power plants' performance for the baseline period and future. And then we aggregate unit level analysis up to the portfolio level. And here's the sort of overview of the portfolio level results, right? We have, baseline and then future projections for the year 2030 under 2 climate scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And if we look at the total columns at the portfolio level, right, we estimate that EBRD could expect an annual generation loss increase from about 0.8 terawatt hours or 0.4%, from 0.8 to 7 terawatt hours. That's a quite significant increase, right, by 2030 under RCP 4.5. And if we look at, individual drivers, then, right, these are the individual drivers: air temperature, drought, flood, air, water temperature. If we look at individual drivers, if you look at the baseline period, right, about 80% of the total generation loss, climate-related generation losses for the baseline period are driven by water temperature. And 85% of that is driven by basically power plants was forced to shut down because of violations of local environmental regulations, or, in other words, cooling water discharge temperature regulations, right? And as water temperature rises, right, in many of these locations, more power plants is going to experience that more often. And also a rising water temperature will start to really affecting cooling efficiency more substantially, because existing power plants are designed based on, historical weather trends, right, weather patterns. And it's designed to work at an optimal condition, right, based on the historical weather trends, right? But with climate changing the weather patterns in many of these locations, these power plants are going to be running more and more at suboptimal conditions in the future because of climate change. So we will see the rising water temperature, for example, affecting cooling efficiency for a lot of these plants. And also similarly for, air temperature, right? Air temperature increase and intensified extreme heat will reduce the generation efficiency of gas turbines and dry cooling systems. So lastly, some key lessons learned and recommendations. As I mentioned, water temperature is, as you might remember, one of the primary drivers for a lot of the generation losses, according to our model. But it's been overlooked by a lot of the mainstream climate disclosure. So we think it's actually really important for them to include water temperature in their guidelines, at least for the power generation sector, right? And then secondly, the current power plant designs are not future climate proof, right? They're designed based off of historical weather data, and power plants are likely to be more and more vulnerable because they will be running at suboptimal conditions more and more often in the future due to climate change. And then thirdly, climate impact on hydro is a mixed bag. This is, overall, when we looked at EBRD's portfolio, hydro portfolio overall, it's likely they're going to experience a reduction in annual generation because of reduced precipitation, right? But for certain power plants, precipitation is actually going to increase. So it is potentially, it could be a potential addition to generation for those power plants. So we should be careful, really careful when interpreting portfolio level assessments for individual sites. And then, we would really encourage actually power utility companies, power plants to disclose more on, historical generation conditions and their physical climate risks, and which really helps, researchers like us and investors like the, development banks to better understand what's really happening, right, in terms of physical climate risks assets are facing. And then lastly, we think, through our analysis, it's been quite time consuming and it requires actually a lot of computing power, technical capacity. So it's really not that accessible and affordable for a lot of organizations, particularly medium to small size organizations in developing countries. So hopefully the work that we're doing can sort of start pushing for a more accessible and affordable climate risk assessment, physical climate risk assessment service. So I'll stop there. And so now I think we are open to questions, if we have any. I don't believe we have any questions for now. Oh, great. So we have a question asking our report launch date. So it is going to be in early December. And, if you're interested in hearing more about the report, definitely I would encourage you to check out our website, and we will share an update on the report launch date very soon. And another question that we have is, are there any plans on applying the method to other portfolios? We are definitely thinking about expanding our methodology to cover other sectors in addition to power sector. So real estate sector, agriculture sector, these are all very relevant sectors that we're thinking about expanding our methods over, and which hopefully would help organizations with a focus in those sectors as well. We have another question here. Which sectors would you like to tackle next? As I mentioned, we are thinking about the real estate sector and agriculture sector in particular, these two sectors. And as we all know, the global ag supply chain, is, well, agriculture in general, I think, at the global scale is the largest water user, and they're most vulnerable to climate change. So definitely agriculture sector. We have another question. Does the report contain some guidance for banks to better incorporate these risks in their internal credit risk? The short answer is no, but I wonder if, James, you wanted to share anything on that. What is our plan in terms of translating what we found into, credit risks or financial risks?
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. No, it's not in the report because it's quite a complicated topic on its own. We have very limited time. I mean, in different TCFD disclosures, such as the EBRD's one, there is some information on how we use such data in our credit assessment process. So that could be a point of reference, but it's not covered in this report, but it's definitely something it's very important to cover.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think we're now on time, about to close up. So thanks everybody for joining. And I'll turn this over to Kate.